And a very good morning to everybody on our webinar here this morning. My name is Francois Fischier. I'm from Growth Diagnostics, and for all other things, I'll be your host this morning. So a very good morning to you, and welcome to the fifth in our series of webinars. This, of course, is sponsored by Access Bank South Africa. We want to invite you to get in contact with Denise from Access Bank if you have any trade finance related needs, or you can go to their website and we'll display her contact details at the end of the presentation on the screen. So this morning, I will not be doing most of the talking, perhaps to great relief of many of you here. Instead, we will hear from Dr. Clive Vinty, who is the head of research from XA International Trade Advisors, and he will discuss designation and government procurement as part of our South African localization series. But I think before I hand over to Clive, perhaps a few introductory remarks and also a little bit of context regarding localization around the world and in particular in South Africa, perhaps. So if we look back in history, we'll find that the percentage of English language books which contain the phrase import substitution rose considerably between the 60s and sort of 2008 until the global financial crisis started. But it reached a peak during the late 70s and 80s. And it would appear at present that this trend is back in vogue, to be honest with you. There are these days increasingly more references and some actions to revitalize the concept of import substitution, or then localization as it is called. So we have this sort of new age industrial policy tendencies emerging in South Africa as we speak. And it sounds like a really good idea until you put it to the test. Imagine we could make everything we need ourselves. That seems to be the current, the current policy direction. But I think we need to ask the question that, is this realistic? And more important, is this even desirable? The first evidence of localization is emerging locally, but we are not making anything new. Instead, we are creating a sort of an array of import tariffs and duties to make imports more expensive. And local firms that are already uncompetitive are being protected in a certain sense, and they will thus have less incentive to become innovative in future. So, to be brutally honest with you, it doesn't sound like an awfully robust economic development plan, to be honest. So what are the possibilities and limitations of localization? This morning, Clive is also going to share from a report that was done on localization. It was commissioned by BUSA and BLSA, done by Intellidex, where they engage with 150 different companies. And from that report, it's very clear that business broadly supports localization, but it doesn't believe that the South African government knows how to do it. Now, in my mind, this sounds very mercantilistic, to be honest with you, i.e., exports are good and imports are bad. But it is a rather silly argument, to be honest, especially to make in a world where we all trade with each other. We can't all just be exporters. I mean, who will we be selling to if everyone follows that type of ideology? So there's no doubt in my mind that local business wants to choose a local product. If it's available, if it is of the right quality, and if it comes with a capacity to supply as well. So there's some degree of localization, based on feelings like patriotism, is completely acceptable, and I should, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if it were to be forced upon industry, with the wrong constraints in place and the right conditions are not in place for sustainable local production, then it will simply upset the balance between price, quality, and capacity. So industry is clearly in favor of localization, but only under the right conditions. However, the new calls for localization are based on protecting what we have and not making new things or making existing industries more competitive for the export market, but rather for the shrinking local market. So these types of policies are creating a siege economy, in my mind, but the exact opposite is what is required in South Africa. We are, in fact, a free country with, after all, with a very progressive constitution which embraces freedom at its core. So, with that having been said, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Clive Inty, and Clive is going to take us through the rest of this webinar. Thank you, Clive.
Thank you, Francois. I hope you can hear me for everybody.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. I just popped my face on screen. As you can see, I've got a face for radio. So I just wanted people to see who I am, and then I'm going to pop out again where I'm more comfortable. So I'm just going to pop up my slides here. Just give me a second and we can get going. So as Francois has so eloquently explained, the context of designation is really the localization policy that the government has been pursuing now for, I'd say, it would look like officially for the last maybe 11 or 12 years. At least that's when we started to see it emerging in our policy space. Now, just to start off, what is designation? In simple terms, designation is the requirement.
Clive, just put your presentation in presentation mode.
Presentation mode, yes, I'll do that. Okay, there you go. So to start off with, I think it's maybe prudent to just define designation. So in simple terms, designation speaks to the idea that you are required by government when they issue out a tender. So when government issues a tender for the supply of a particular product or service, you are required to produce the products. For specific products, you're required to produce products locally, and you're required to use local components. So the designation can occur in terms of products and also in terms of services. It's not clear what that would look like in terms of services, but in terms of products, we have designations. But the idea is that the product or service must be produced locally, and the components or the raw materials or the inputs that you would use must be from come from South Africa or produced locally. Now, what is the context of designation? So having understood what designation is, the idea that it's two requirements, that you produce the products locally and that you use local raw materials. And there's a certain percentage that is attached to that. So you might find, for example, for a particular product, they might say for railway rolling stock, let's say they say it's 65% local content requirement. What that means is that in terms of the raw materials that you would use to produce that particular railway rolling stock, 65% in terms of value of that product must come from local raw materials. So there's a calculation that comes with that, which we'll get into, but not in specific terms, because obviously it's not really necessary for now. But the context of designation, at least officially from the government perspective, arises from the Local Procurement Accord of 2011. Now, the Local Procurement Accord actually came out of the New Growth Path, which is an economic policy that sought to create about 5 million jobs by 2020. And one of the accords that was signed out of the New Growth Path was the idea of a Local Procurement Accord, which I think was the third accord signed out of the New Growth Path. And in the Local Procurement Accord, the idea there was that one of the methods that government would use to ensure localization was the issue of designation. But more appropriately, there within the Local Procurement Accord, the target that was set by the NEDLAC partners, being organized business, being represented by BUSA, organized labor, the government itself, and the social and community groups. Those four NEDLAC partners had agreed at that within the Local Procurement Accord that the idea would be that they would target a 75% target in terms of local procurement for product and services by both the public and the private sector, which is quite a lofty goal. And one of the methods that they would seek to achieve that would be designation. And within the Local Procurement Accord, the policy genesis per se, or the origins of designation arose from there, because in that accord, it was mooted that they would come up with preferential procurement regulations, which would substantiate the preferential procurement the act itself, the PPPFA. The PPPFA, of course, comes out of the Constitution. So if you go back a few step back, actually, if you look at the Constitution, in Section 217 of the Constitution, it allows for the preferential allocation of contracts. So you look at Section 217 of the Constitution, it says you can preferentially award contracts, meaning tenders can be preferentially allowed. Of course, we now have the the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, which gives effect to the Constitution, because the Constitution required that legislation needed to be promulgated that gives effect to Section 217 of the Constitution. So then the PPPFA came in. The Act is a fairly short piece of legislation, probably has about 5 to 6 sections. Doesn't say much about designation, but then calls for the minister to adopt regulations. Now, those regulations were only adopted after the Local Procurement Accord came out. So you look at the Constitution, Section 217. It calls for legislation to come out. We have the legislation, which is the PPPFA. Then in 2011, we have the Local Procurement Accord. The Local Procurement Accord then says we need to ensure localization. We have a target of 75% for both the public and the private sector in terms of procurement, both for the public and private sector. In their designation is mentioned for the first time, and it will be effected through the preferential procurement regulations. They were already there, but the 2011 iteration or the 2011 version of those regulations would then provide for designation specifically. So you would see in the 2011 regulations, they provide for designation. Now, what's interesting in that Local Procurement Accord, in fact, is that the government clarifies there that they had already had a couple of lists that they sent out to business where they were considering designating in terms of identifying products for designation and discussing with business as to which products they should designate. So examples of that are things like clothing, textiles, leather, footwear, power pylons, bus bodies, railway rolling stock, pharmaceuticals, and food and canning and the canning apparel. So at that particular point in time, government had, according to the Local Procurement Code, given the list to industry, and they were discussing them. And government committed within the Local Procurement Accord, in fact, firstly to have a public process of designation where they would consult with industry in terms of identifying products that they should designate. And to reiterate, designation is the idea that you must produce the products locally and you must use local components to produce those products. So government said we'll consult with industry publicly and you will be notified. But a second commitment that government had actually done there was that they will seek to measure designation. I think as early as June 2012, they say they'll publish their first report on designation to measure its impact in terms of the competitiveness of the relevant industry and job creation, because the idea was essentially to just ensure industrialization, and that would be achieved through one of the levers that would achieve that was through designation. So within the Local Procurement Accord, we see the genesis of designation, with government saying we will ensure that there's designation, which is essentially a form of localization. We will publicly go through this process. There'll be lists that will be disseminated to the industry, and we'll measure designation. And annually, at least, there should be some form of report that gives an idea of where designation sits. So it sits from the Local Procurement Accord. Then, of course, we have the 2011 Preferential Procurement Regulations. Then eventually, designation makes it into the current Preferential Procurement Regulations, which is the 2017 Preferential Procurement Regulations, which, of course, have gone through recent litigation, which you might be aware of. But in any case, we have the Local Procurement Accord. We have the Preferential Procurement Regulations that then allow for designation. And then we have the first designation actually in 2012. So about 6 to 7 months later, after the Local Procurement Accord, in 2012, we have the first designation happening. So you look at things like, for example, railway rolling stock, bus bodies, those are sort of the earliest designated products that we have at a specific, obviously, percentage. But localization, since that point in time, then eventually found itself into the current administration's economic policy, which is the South African Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. So the ERRP, as it's commonly referred to, is sort of the primary policy now in terms of industrialization, and it's the primary economic policy in South Africa. And in there, the presidency identifies localization as one of the policy interventions to achieve industrialization in South Africa. And so we now know then that it's clearly coming from 2011. We have it in the new growth path, but now we have it in the ERP as one of the measures through which we can achieve localization. Now, localization is further elaborated upon by the DTIC's policy statement on localization for jobs and industrial growth. And furthermore, even more recently, the Competition Commission just published a localization policy in terms of collaboration initiatives between competitors, because we know that there's been obviously the master plans process where competitors have been sitting on the table discussing issues like demand forecasting and projects that they wish to engage in localization initiatives. And in there, without trying to define localization, because government policy is still unclear on what localization actually means. But in simple terms, localization seems to, having looked at the ERP, the TTIC policy statement of localization, the idea is to increase local production of goods and services. That's essentially what localization seems to be from my perspective, that we need to increase local production of goods and services. Now, furthermore, in terms of context for localization, we also have obviously the Intelitex report that Francois had just eloquently highlighted, and some of the issues that came out of there. But the key output that came out of the Intelitex report, which was commissioned by BUSA, which is obviously the organized business representative at NEDLAC, and the BLSA, the Business Leadership South Africa, was that we are not ready to do localization, at least in the short term. They foresee that it's possible, at least in the long term, but not in the short to medium term, because they believe that government they don't believe that government actually understands the capacity of local industry. They don't believe that the conditions necessary for localization exist. They do believe that there are certain products, for example, for which localization can occur in the short term, but they don't believe that they believe that in the long term, at least. They believe that for the most of the products that government seeks to localize, they will not probably succeed because they just don't have the right conditions on the ground. And they believe that if localization is pushed through, at least with the current rhetoric on localization, at least in the short to medium term, they believe that localization will push prices up by up to 20%. There was another study, for example, that was also done by the EU, for example, together with Southern African industry, which also sort of arrived at the conclusion that, in fact, the impact of the localization policies in South Africa is prices, at least in the renewable sector, by up to 10%. So localization, from the Intelitex report and even from the EU report, is clear that it's going to push up prices at least from up to between 10% from the EU's perspective and up to 20% from the Intelitex report, because they don't believe that without the necessary conditions in the market, it's just not going to happen in a way that will actually be able to be manageable in terms of cost. And we see this cost factor actually arising out of designation, which we'll highlight later on. Now, furthermore, in terms of context for designation, which, like I said, is sort of a species of localization, we have the WTO revised agreement on government procurement. And we know that South Africa is a member, is a party to the WTO agreement and the agreements that come with it, agreements like the GATT, and so on. The agreement that we've not signed up to for now is the revised agreement on government procurement, which is the WTO agreement. And it's pretty obvious why we've not signed up to this agreement, because that agreement is built on two fundamental principles which South Africa would not be able to agree with based on our localization policy. The first thing being that the WTO agreement is built on government procurement, is built on the issue of equity, that you need to have non-discrimination. Non-discrimination in terms of you cannot discriminate between state parties in terms of government procurement. So if you give a concession to another state, let's say you give a concession to Botswana in terms of government procurement, you have to give the same concession you've given to suppliers from Botswana to suppliers, for example, from, let's say, Eswatini, for example. That's the MFN principle, the most favored nation principle, the idea that you must give the same concessions you've given to one trading partner under the WTO to another trading partner. That's the one principle. The second principle is the national treatment principle, the idea that the suppliers, the local suppliers in South Africa, must be given the same benefits as the foreign suppliers. So the WTO government procurement agreement refuses the idea that you can do localization which favors what? The idea that you must favor local production and local suppliers. This is what designation is, the idea that you would allocate certain tenders specifically for local suppliers who must then produce the products using local components. That is prohibited specifically within that government procurement agreement under the WTO, because it says you cannot favor local suppliers at the expense of foreign suppliers. Similarly, in fact, the idea of designations of the domestic local content requirement, because designation is essentially a domestic local content requirement, is actually expressly prohibited within the agreement, because the agreement it prohibits offsets, and offsets especially is basically the idea of domestic content, your localization requirement or your domestic content requirement. So it's clear then within the government procurement agreement sitting within the WTO that it is prohibited. South Africa has not signed up to the agreement, and we can see why, because obviously, if it did, it would be in contravention of, firstly, the national treatment requirement that you need to treat your local suppliers similarly with your foreign suppliers the same, equally. And similarly that, you would have to do away with the local, the domestic local content requirement, which we will not be able to do because we want obviously to push that through coming out of the Constitution and the PPPFA. So that is the context. So we know that designation comes out of the Local Procurement Accord, started in 2011. The first designation was in 2012. And we know that it sits within the context of localization proceeding out of the ERRP and the TTIC policy statement on localization. We know studies have been done, commissioned in respect of designation, outlining some of the problems that they foresee in terms of localization in general, but obviously feeding into designation. So where are we in terms of this? So far, 28 products have been designated, the earliest ones being railway rolling stock from 2012, bus bodies, power pylons, set-top boxes have been designated, solar water heaters, plastic pipes, water and fittings. We also have the most recent designation, actually, which was cement, which incidentally, none of us were aware of that it was being considered for designation, but lo and behold, we were just told cement has been designated. So I've explained what designation is, the idea that goods must be produced locally and we must use local components. So what is the law on designation? I've already highlighted that it comes out of presently the 2017 regulations under the preferential procurement regulations of 2017. We know that these regulations, in fact, were before the Constitutional Court. There's a fairly sort of arduous history related to the litigation that had happened here. But what we know is that Agribusiness had challenged these regulations, not necessarily the designation requirement, but Agribusiness had challenged the idea of pre-qualification criteria, which was declared unconstitutional and invalid by the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court. But of course, the declaration of invalidity was then suspended for a period of a year. And then somehow the Constitutional Court had the matter when it came before the Constitutional Court, because initially they were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. It was appealed to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court, then what it did was it had the matter, and then it decided essentially after it decided that the regulations will be declared unconstitutional. But the whole period that this happened, the declaration of invalidity eventually lapsed because because of the litigation that had happened then. But to not get too much into it, the long and short of it is that last year you might have realized that there's a time when government was unsure about whether there was a legislative framework for public procurement, because as it had happened was that when the decision was made by the Constitutional Court, they not only declared the pre-qualification criteria in the designation regulations of 2017 unconstitutional, they also declared designation to be unconstitutional. So now suddenly you're at a situation whereby how then do you go about publishing tenders when the regulations themselves have been declared unconstitutional? But of course, we know that because an appeal had been done to the Constitutional Court in that regard, the appeal then obviously allowed for what? It allowed for the regime to continue, but government was unsure and the whole host of litigation happened to try and clarify the position. But we now know for all intents and purposes that the regulations still exist, and the declaration of invalidity will last for another year, and government still has time to come up with a new set of regulations. So the long and short of it is that we are governed by the 2017 regulations, which have a fairly contentious litigation, at least in the last couple of years. But we know that government has published a new set of regulations, a draft set of regulations for 2022, which should come in this year to replace the 2017 ones, which essentially have been declared invalid and unconstitutional. But that declaration obviously has been suspended for a year. When those come in, the 2022 regulations, they actually don't have designation, which is the big one. So they don't have designation within them. But at present, because we're still using the 2017 regulations, designation is still allowed. But when the 2022 ones kick in, it's not clear as yet whether they will have designation or not, but we know that draft set didn't actually provide for designation. But who designates? Well, the TTIC actually does the designation in consultation with Treasury, and when the designation is done, it is then sent to National Treasury to send out a circular to the market to notify us that in fact a designation has happened. So then how are these bids for designation actually, the tender bids, evaluated? Well, they're evaluated at two stages. The first stage is actually the evaluation on designation, in the sense that have you actually complied with the requirement for local production and in terms of using local components. And the local components requirement is a percentage. So, for example, you might be required to use 8% in terms of the value of the product coming out of local raw materials. So there's two stages. The first stage is they'll evaluate whether you've complied with the local content requirement. And normally what you would do is that when you make the application for the tender, you would then supply a document, which is an annexure where you outline your compliance with the local content requirement. You would also normally provide a document that outlines how much imported content you have used, and also in terms of the whole tender. So essentially, the first declaration you do is one that talks about the particular product, what is the local component, and how you produced it locally. The second one outlines the value of the important content. Then the third document you'd provide, which is these are annexures, would be the one that calculates the local content in terms of the whole tender that you're applying for. Then the second stage, obviously, is the price and BEE evaluation. So essentially, if you don't comply with the local content requirement at stage one, your tender will be disqualified and you will no longer be in the running. So, of course, this leads us to the exemption mechanism. We can agree that obviously not all the products that have been designated, it will not be always that you'll be able to find. It will not be always that you'll be able to find the raw materials locally. Sometimes we just don't have the raw material for you to be able to produce a product, but the product has been designated. In that instance, there's actually an exemption mechanism. The legal basis of it is unclear to me, but I don't doubt its utility, because obviously we know that there are products that we can't make with our local raw materials because we just don't have the raw material. But there is an exemption mechanism, and typically you would get the exemption and you would submit it together with your tender application. The timeline of getting the exemption is typically between 48 hours to 7 days. It's a fairly quick process from what the DTIC says, and I haven't seen anything to the contrary. But normally you would require that application for exemption to be supported, obviously, by the local industry, which will confirm that indeed they don't have that particular raw material. So what happens if you are aggrieved in terms of designation and you would you want some relief? So what is the legal relief that is available for you in terms of the preferential procurement regulations? We know Section 14 of the preferential procurement regulations does have a remedy for you in terms of for an aggrieved party. The first remedy you have within Section 14 of the preferential procurement regulation. So let's say someone has falsified the local content requirement, and that has happened before. We have litigation to that effect. We have the C2 of Tshwane case versus PowerTech. In that case, there was falsification. So someone essentially lied about the local content requirement. And in that case, the court sort of explained the idea of how does Section 14 of the preferential procurement regulations happen, because we know that designation happens within the 2017 regulations in Section 8. And we know that Section 14 then deals with someone who has falsified the local content requirement, because you can think about it that for a person to apply for that tender, for example, let's say for bus bodies or for railway rolling stock, they might not be able to comply with the local content requirement, and they may be tempted to falsify. And they may even be tempted to falsify because we know that the verification process is not as extensive as it could be. If they are caught falsifying, they're given an opportunity to explain and make a case for themselves in line with due process requirements. But in essence, if they're found to have contravened the regulations in that regard, they can disqualify or cancel the contract in part or whole of it. And I find this to be problematic because if someone has falsified the local content requirement, it shouldn't be that we should cancel part of the contract. We should be able to cancel the whole contract. There's also a damages avenue, so you can also get monetary compensation for the conduct of that particular contractor. One can also be restricted from doing business for up to 10 years with government in that regard, and that is a very I think a proper penalty for that particular infraction. Also, the Treasury also keeps and maintains and publishes a list of restricted suppliers on its website. So you'll be able to see which businesses have been restricted from doing businesses, and also, obviously from a goodwill perspective, their name will be tainted if they are part of this list. So that's sort of the main tool that sits within the preferential procurement regulations of 2017 in terms of a person who has falsified their local content requirement when they apply for a tender. So where are we with designation now? We know it proceeded from 2011 into the 2017 preferential procurement regulations. So far, we've got 28 designated products. But of course, this is particularly confusing because we refer to 28 products or sectors or industry. It's not clear what that means. And now, if you go and look at the products that have been designated, the 28, it's unclear whether these are products or whether this is a sector or whether this is actually a subsector or whether this is an industry. And if you're to count the actual, let's call them products for designation, they actually number more than 28. Some people say it's up to 100 if you're to actually count them. So if you go to the TTIC website and look at the so-called designations that have happened, it's not really 28 in number. It might be 28 in terms of broad general, like a general umbrella term. But if you were to actually count them, there will be more than 100. But we know that from the IPAP, the Industrial Policy Action Plan, that about 60 billion from government, according to government, 60 billion has been locked into the country based on the local content requirement. Now, what does government think of its its own policy? So what does government think in terms of designation? Well, the IPAP is quite clear on that, and I'll read verbatim from there. It says, however, there are no stringent legal and administrative measures to deal with non-compliance. Government is currently too uncoordinated, fragmented, and institutionally weak to carry out the function of adequately monitoring compliance on localization. So generally speaking, in terms of localization, and particularly even in terms of designation, government is clear that it's simply uncoordinated, fragmented, and institutionally weak to carry out the function. This is not from us, this is from the Industrial Policy Action Plan from government. And generally speaking, municipalities struggle with the local content requirement in terms of designation. They struggle with understanding the requirement. They struggle with the advertising of the local content requirement, and they struggle with just verification of this local content requirement. Now, just to be clear, designation typically, like I said, is done by the TTIC in consultation, obviously, with the National Treasury. But of course, we know that the provincial procurement regulations actually do allow self-designations, meaning a particular government organ like a municipality or a government department, even if a product has not been designated for local production, can actually self-designate. But when they do that, they will have to consult, obviously, with the DTIC and National Treasury in that regard. So apart from the normal designations that we have, the 28 designations that we know that have been published that are available on the DTIC website, government departments can still self-designate on their own to say, for this particular tender, we actually want to give it to local suppliers for local production and using local content. But in that regard, they obviously have to go through the National Treasury. So what has changed? We know that we have the draft provincial procurement regulations of 2022 proceeding out of the Afri-Business litigation. But like I said, essentially what has happened in that particular regard is that we had litigation. The litigation led us to a point where the regulations were declared invalid, but that declaration was suspended. The Constitutional Court took more than a year to make its decision. And then what essentially happened was that the declaration of invalidity lapsed. Government was no longer sure as to whether there was a preferential procurement regulations framework. But of course it was there, because we know that once there's an appeal of a decision, then the declaration of invalidity essentially was no longer in application up until the Constitutional Court made its decision. When it made its decision, it confirmed that indeed the regulations were invalid, and then the declaration of invalidity then kicked in again for another year. So in simple terms, we have the 2017 regulations still available for a few more months. Government has time to come up with a new set of regulations. And like I've said to you, in there, we don't see designation being available. We have a new standard that is used to calculate local content, but the definition hasn't changed in terms of local content. The key output of the new standard, the SANS 1286-2017, is that the SABS, which is responsible for verifying the local content requirements. So when you apply for the tender, you would submit the documents I spoke to you about, the different annexures outlining how you have complied with the local content requirement. The verification used to be done primarily by SABS only, which is the South African Bureau of Standards, but now we know that qualified auditors can do verification also together with industry specialists. The TTIC, from what we see from some of the PowerPoints they've uploaded online, some of the presentations they've done, says that they've allocated about 22 million towards verification. We're not really sure of this amount, but this is something that you find when you just do a basic Google search to see what the TTIC is doing on local content. According to TTIC, they verified about 74% typically of tenders are verified in terms of value, but only 10% in terms of number. So in terms of value, about 75% more almost is verified, but in terms of number, only about 10%. So it's clear that there's a huge gap in terms of the verification when it comes to local content compliance. What are the current problems with designation? Well, I think it's obvious by now. None of us really know when a designation is being considered. It's not published in the Government Gazette. What we know about designation is that when a circular is sent out by Treasury, we get told this product has been designated. For example, cement was the latest one. But you'll find that in the industry or in the market, many corporations still don't know that a particular product has actually been designated. But the biggest issue is transparency. The other issue, obviously, if there's a problem with transparency, it ties in with the issue of procedural fairness. We know that the relevant industry from what we look at in the market is never really aware that the product is being considered for designation. We know in the local procurement accord, government committed to say they will consult with industry widely, it will be a public process, and there will be a measurement every year. At least you have an idea of what designation has done and its impact on the market. We don't have that data available. What we do know is that we only ever know about designation when a circular comes out of Treasury. We don't know when a product is being considered for designation. We don't know about the consultations that happen. That also obviously has an impact on the rationality of the process of designation. We don't know what evidence do they have when they decide on designation, and whether that evidence is connected to the final decision to consider a designation. It also then obviously raises questions about the arbitrariness of the decision. Can we say that the decision is really a sound decision? Can we say that the decision is really based on evidence? We don't know. We don't know whether designation is good or bad because we don't really have any data, because the process is not transparent. We don't believe there's procedural fairness, and we don't believe that there's rationality in terms of the problem. So how do we fix designation going forward? Well, these are my thoughts on it. We believe that designation can be addressed. Firstly, in the public procurement bill, the draft public procurement bill that went out for comment, we see that in chapter 4, in section 26 of that proposed act that will consolidate all the law on public procurement, that designation is going to be there. So even though the 2022 regulations might not provide for designation, we know that when the public procurement act comes out, eventually when it comes out, it will probably have designation, because in section 26, it already provides for the preferential allocation of tenders in resort. The preferential allocation of tenders for what? For local production. So we know that in the Public Procurement Act, eventually when it comes out, government proposes to have designation. And we believe out of there must be designation regulations. We believe designation should not sit within the public procurement regulations. It should actually sit as a specific set of regulations, because designation is a trade policy. So in the same way that we have trade policy on dumping, for example, safeguards and subsidies, we believe that designation, because of its significance, should be sitting with its own particular trade policy. And then that ties in with the idea that, in fact, ITAC, which is the primary administrative body that deals with trade remedies in South Africa, is the most qualified body to deal with designation. We believe that the designation regulation should be administered by ITAC. So we believe the process of designation must go through ITAC. With the regulations, we believe in the regulations, they need to be aligned with PAJA. So if you align them with PAJA, which is the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, what we'll then have then is, for the first time, procedural fairness. We will have lawfulness, we'll have reasonableness. We'll also have a right to reasons as to why a product has been designated. We will, for the first time, have an investigation report, because at present, we have products that have been designated. We don't know what happened and how we got to that point of designation. When we look up, for example, when a dumping duty is imposed on a product, there's an investigation report. There's a preliminary investigation report. There's a final investigation report. We don't have that with designation as a trade policy. If we come up with a specific set of regulations administered by ITAC as the most qualified body to deal with trade policy, we can then have a process of gazetting a decision to consider designating a product. We can then have a notice and comment process where the public and the industry can comment on a particular proposed designation. We can then have an investigation report explaining the decision and how we got to designation. And of course, one of the other things that we can do currently, at least with designation, we can also compensate the organs of state for the increased cost of acquiring products locally, because as we have outlined, typically whenever there's a designation, the products in terms of the input costs actually are driven up, the pricing. So we need to find a way to compensate these local companies. One of the companies that have recently complained about dealing with increased costs in terms of localization is, for example, Transnet. So we have to find a mechanism for government to compensate these particular government institutions that are having to deal with increased costs. So in essence, the idea of fixing designation has to be aligned with the idea of administrative justice, coming up with a specific set of regulations and letting the process be run by ITAC, which is an independent administrative body, which will then run a very public notice and comment process, give us access to an investigation report and reasons for why we believe that designation should be made a public policy. So in essence, that is my take on designation. You can see our details there in terms of the work that we do with designation. I'm going to hand you over back now to Francois to just look at if there's any questions that we can engage on in terms of what I've spoken to you guys about.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you very much for that very insightful overview of designation. Clive, if I can ask, I mean, designation is a very far-reaching policy, as we've seen throughout the presentation this morning. But how do we know if this policy has been successful? Has the DTI published any evidence to justify, the localization policies as we see them today? To your knowledge, Clive?
No, I've not seen any information or data that speaks to the success of designation, because we know from the Local Procurement Accord, government had clarified that they would give us at least some progress reports on designation, at least to show on employment and its impact. We haven't found it. In fact, to cobble a picture of designation is very difficult. What we have, obviously, information on the DTIC website about the products that have been designated, the exemption process, but nothing else apart from that. If anything, some of the picture we've sort of managed to gather from designation has been from PowerPoint presentations when DTIC is presented to a particular group of people, maybe parliament or a particular group of industry, for example. But it's very difficult to find any information really about what is the impact of designation since its inception in around 2011, 2012. So we don't have any data, unfortunately, at present.
Thank you. That's rather worrying, in my mind, in my opinion. I think we should test the impact of policies and not only the intentions of policies. And I'm borrowing here from the late Nobel laureate Professor Milton Friedman from the University of Chicago back then. Because if we designation and localization on face value sounds like fantastic ideas. I mean, you get local industry to do more. I mean, what's not to like about something like that? But those are the very intentions of these policies. If we don't have evidence to point whether they've been successful or not, and it is rather worrying. Localization also adds, it's very clear from the talk this morning, more constraints to industry. It now also wants us also wants to stipulate not only who can participate, but also who you can buy from. So we have preferential people requirements. Now we have preferential product requirements as well, it seems. And this, in my mind, does constrain supply. And eventually, as we've seen from some empirical analysis, prices will react. And I don't know where the funding is going to come from to pay for localization. If public entities are forced to buy certain local products, and those ones do come at higher prices, I'm not sure where the funding is going to come from. I mean, we are experiencing this current tax bonanza from the higher commodity prices, which we are benefiting from, but this will not remain, ad infinitum. It will, but there is an end. We do know that commodity prices, hard and soft ones, are cyclical in nature. So I think when it comes to designation, we have to ask ourselves, and localization, can we in fact regulate ourselves into economic growth? Is that even possible? In my mind, I don't think that is possible, to be brutally honest with you. And I think without an evidence-based and without a transparent approach to these policies, I doubt whether they will deliver the results that we intend for them to deliver. I also think that it's probably, while we're on the topic, Clive, it's worthwhile mentioning that localization in a complex economy like South Africa, which is still reasonably complex, it's losing some of its complexity, unfortunately. I don't think it's possible with a top-down approach to managing the economy. The complexity of supply chains are simply too high. And Clive, you've mentioned, some of that came out of the Intellidex report, but the complexity of supply chains, I think, is a major determinant, or should be a major determinant, in order to decide on which supply chains or industries, to be subject to localization requirements. The food and beverages industry if you look at the intelligence report, can localize much faster compared to the electronic equipment sectors, for instance. The public protection equipment, the PPE ones, is also rather simple. You can use existing machinery, you can use existing workers, you can produce rather similar things, and you can quickly transfer capacity, to similar project or to similar products rather. But that is rather fundamentally different to photovoltaic cell manufacturing, for instance, for renewable energies. And in addition to that, it's vastly different to inputs from mining infrastructure equipment, which is extremely complex and very niche. So I think we should take a step back and think, for government to try and mastermind which goods we should get from where and who should be able to produce them, which products to designate, etc., is a very tall order, and in my mind, a rather unrealistic one. Even with perfect information, it is simply not possible, in my mind at least, to map the whole economy and all its industrial production processes. This is authoritarian at best and an extremely undesirable in my mind. I want to mention one thing. We've made reference earlier on, Clive, that it's very much a conversation about South Africa's designation and about South Africa's localization ambitions and endeavors and goings on. But of course, there is also China's dual circulation strategy that we've seen that have emerged. I think it was last year, the second half of the year. This does not necessarily mean, at least from what I've seen in the literature so far, that the country is in fact lurching into autarky, if you will. Instead, I think China is likely to move towards import substitution wherever possible in the pursuit of, let's call it, economic resilience. I think, however, that such a move will come at a great cost, and it will also have ramifications for the global economy, that is, and very much so for the domestic Chinese private sector. And more importantly, for foreign companies, I think, that are, that are in China, and it could prove to be quite far-reaching. Of course, there's also some buzzwords that have developed around this over the last less than 12 months. They are so-called common prosperity and national rejuvenation that has been spoken about extensively, especially by Xi Jinping. No one really knows what this means. Maybe less trade with the US and maybe more trade with Russia, I don't know. But I think it's going to be very hard to break that symbiotic trade relationship between the USA and between China. That relationship, although the two very parties that benefit from that do not like it, both of them have become significantly richer over the last 20 years because of that. So China has ascended to the world's biggest trading nation over the last 20 years or so, and I think it is reflected in their centrality to global supply chains. But China has combined a huge pool of low-cost labor with high-functioning infrastructure to produce at massive scale in manufacturing. So a rather very different, two very different countries, and I'm not going to say with similar localization or designation strategies, but with similar things going on. So there's a question here. It comes from Skalkberger. How can we improve verification? Would ITEC have capacity or be capacitated to do this? Could we potentially use international or industry organizations for verification and international best practices and standards? Scott from Engineering News. Clive, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I think so I'll sort of tackle each question per question, so because I think all of it's sort of related anyway, but maybe I'll just give a broad answer in that case, since it's all about verification. So verification used to be a monopoly of the South African Bureau of Standards, and I think government has actually improved verification, at least in terms of institutionally, by publishing the new standard, the SANS 1286 2017. So the 2011 standard obviously only focused on the SABS as the only body that was verifying. But now the new standard, the SANS 1286/2017, which is the standard, the SABS, South African Bureau Standard standard, that is used to calculate local content, that defines all the different things like what is local content, what is important content, and so on. In there, it has opened up the verification bodies to not only be itself, the South African Bureau of Standards, but also to include an industry a specialist and also a qualified auditor. So I think the pool of people that can do verification has already broadened. So I think government has done a good job with the new standard of broadening the scope of bodies that can do verification to include auditors and also to include industry specialists. So I think that will go a long way in assisting the SABS in terms of verification. Now, the next question would ITAC have capacity to do this? Well, definitely ITAC would have capacity to do it. I'm not sure if they would have the expertise, but I'm sure that can be done. ITAC already has ready-made experts who do verifications actually for all the other trade remedies. So if you think about an application for an anti-dumping duty, an application for safeguards, or we don't really do normal the subsidies one, but if you were to do a subsidy investigation, ITAC has ready-made investigators who, when an application is done for a duty to be imposed, which is a trade remedy or trade policy, if you want to call it that, ITAC would actually conduct a verification. So they would typically do an actual verification on the shop floor, on the actual assembly plant, or they would do, like recently, like a desktop verification. But typically they would actually go on the ground and do an actual verification. So ITAC does verification. Normally it is required by the WTO requirements to do verification for all applications to verify if indeed there is a prima facie case, to see that there's an actual application in terms of there's an actual, let's say, contravention or infraction on the merits. So ITAC has extensive capacity to do verifications, particularly on trade remedies, which we believe designation to be. And we don't think that it will be difficult for ITAC to assist, particularly in verifying the local content requirement, because ITAC works with local industry anyway a lot of the time. So any application that is done by local industry, ITAC is the one that works and liaises with that relevant industry to verify the information that they've submitted. So I think ITAC is best suited to do the verification because they already do it with other trade remedies. So it's not something that is out of their wheelhouse, for want of a better word. Could we use potentially international or industry organizations? I think the fact that we can use in the new standard, we can use industry specialists already sort of speaks to industry organizations. And I think, in fact, using industry organizations together with the industry specialists would actually be helpful. I'm not too sure about international organizations, but at least we can comply at the very least with the international best practices. So yes, in summation, I think verification has been improved in terms of the number of people who can do verification. That has been broadened. Secondly, ITAC is definitely best place to do it. And thirdly, obviously, I do believe that we can use industry associations. Of course, they would have to obviously, I think, be registered to get with the TTIC for them to do that.
Thank you, Clive. That's a mouthful, but thank you very much. We have a request here from Mimi. Mimi has a burning desire to rather speak and not type. So can we perhaps allow Mimi a chance to have a chat with us in Pumelelo?
Yes, certainly. She is allowed to talk.
Maybe you can. Okay. Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
And so this feels like you're coming here. This is very much also in line with talking down to us. So we should organize. It's been wonderful. It's full of information, but I think besides that, because now there's so many things before the end of the session. We've said a lot of things that could like one of the
Mimi, if I could just interrupt you there. We are really struggling to hear you, and it would seem it's not only myself.
I'm saying it's not. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm saying there hasn't been enough time to engage with this. Clive presented for the bulk of this 1 hour session, and Francois, you had a first stab at asking the question, and he spent a lot of time engaging with that and answering you. And now we're left with 3 minutes before the end of the session. It feels like you just came here to give us this message that localization can't be done. We haven't really been given an opportunity. And also, can we get a sense of who's in the meeting? I don't know why we are not allowed to speak. We are muted. We can't see who the participants are. We'd really like to know who's in this session. But very lastly, I just want to say, localization is another measure, is another way of protectionism. If you're really going to be opening up our markets, be flooded in with imports from China, we're never going to win. The designation processes, the designation of certain sectors by DTI is one of our government policies that we need to follow, and it begins to set aside certain industries, certain sectors that have got ease of entry maybe for our local suppliers. We got to start somewhere. If we are going to be driving made in SA campaigns, and we've got a proud SA and all of these things, are we saying we should abandon all of those efforts and just stick to made in China? It can't be. There's a lot of policies that government promulgates and laws that we have to follow. This is one of them. It's not a question of it can be done or it can't be done, and we must just sit this one out. We have to find ways to do it, because really a job that is lost through imports of products from China is a job that could have gone to a South African or a local. And you're saying we must just abandon it. At the start, at a bare minimum, public procurement is the way to go. Privately, yes. It's almost like you're trying to influence strategies of private companies, which is a little bit difficult. But publicly, I think that there's definitely a way and a route to follow in terms of starting to influence our procurement to make sure that we procuring from local suppliers. I really don't agree with the bulk. It's giving us all the procurement accords and where it's coming from and all of that. But it's been very short in looking at measures and ways and initiatives and anything really that we could begin to do to influence this localization agenda. I mean, we can really never compete with China. They flout environmental laws, they flout labor laws, they do a lot of things that make it easy for them to produce their goods. So we can't compete with them. But we've got to find ways now to do it in our own way, so that at least we set aside and we manage to create jobs for our own people. It's not going to be blanketly applied to everything, because we haven't got everything yet. But certainly, setting aside, starting from somewhere, will definitely eventually get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mimi. Yeah, thank you for those comments. I want to be very clear here this morning that we are not against localization. Localization under the right conditions, as I've mentioned, certainly makes sense. It is a matter of ensuring that the conditions under which we apply localization, are the right conditions, so that we get the desired outcome of the intention of the policy, so that we don't have unintended consequences. And conversations like this are designed so that we can talk about these issues. These are open webinars. They're open to the public. Anybody can participate in them. There is no cost to participate. There is no barrier. You just need a broadband connection. If you would like to engage in more conversation about the matter, of course, there's far more to be covered than what we can cover in only an hour. Please reach out to us, and we can continue the conversation. But the webinar series that we have here is an open forum. Anybody can join, and where we talk about some of the work that we are involved in. So I think let me have a look at this. Clive, there's one question here from Tafatswa. Thank you for the comprehensive session and presentation. If you can just clarify in a line. So the 2017 preferential regulations are currently in force with the original unconstitutional provisions until the 2022 regulations are published, is the question, Clive?
Yeah, so in short, in short, the 2017 regulations, I don't have the exact dates, but they're still valid up until the period which government was given to come up with a new set lapses. So what can happen is that either the government can come up with a new set, and then we have the new set of regulations and we continue that. Or if government doesn't come up with a new set within the deadline they've been given by the Constitutional Court, then they will lapse. So at present, we have the 2017 regulations applying up until obviously the suspended period of invalidity lapses. When the period of invalidity, the suspended period of invalidity lapses, it will mean that it will kick in and they'll become invalid. So what government in simple terms has to do is that they have to come up with the 2022 regulations before that period they've been given to come up with the new set lapses. If they do that, then obviously the new system kicks in. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does.
And maybe just one thing, Francois, just to Mimi's point, we don't actually disagree. I think with Mimi, I don't know if designation is good or bad, because we don't have any data that tells us whether it's good or bad. We actually don't have a problem with designation because we don't know whether it's good or bad. We actually, the idea here was to suggest ways to improve the process of designation so that we as the market can get to know which products are being designated so that we can designate the correct products for localization and we can improve the process. The idea of improving designation is to actually arrive at the correct products being designated for which we have capacity for. So I don't think even from the Intelitex report, it's clear that business is in support of localization. It's just the manner in which the process is being done that they have a problem with. And the issue that we were raising here was that we don't believe that there's been transparency and procedural fairness in the process. We all want the same thing. It's just that we want the process to be more open and more transparent so that we're able to assess whether the policy can actually work or not. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Clive. And I agree with you on that. You know, we live in a democracy, so it is the role of civil society to engage in debate about the very policies, economic policies. So it is crucial that we have conversations like this, and we will have different views, but there's nothing wrong with having different views. A democracy is all about, airing, each one having the ability to air their views. And never forget, government is there to represent the will of the people, what the people want, not what government wants. So I think we are well over the hour, but I think we've gone through all the questions. We've had healthy participation and debate at the same time. So I want to thank each and every one of you that attended the webinar this morning. I hope you found value from it. If you've registered for the webinar and you've been on here, then you'll get an email soon with the slides from Clive. The recording will also be edited and go onto YouTube so you can watch it. It's not behind a paywall or anything. It's open to the public. Again, there are no barriers to access the information. If you want to have a further conversation, Mimi certainly seems to engage us further. Reach out to us via email, via telephone. We are happy to do so. So thank you very much to Access Bank for sponsoring these webinar series. Clive, thank you for your time this morning and a valuable contribution. This is Francois Fischer, and with that, it's the end of it. Thank you very much, people. Cheers.